You want to piss people off? Go outside and hire all your outside for your promotions. And I'll tell you, my best hires have always been people I've promoted. The no asshole rule. I can't say this enough. In organizations, you're going to have some people who are very effective, but they're assholes. They're terrible. And you know what? It's very hard sometimes to fire those people because they're getting the results. But if you want to hurt a company, have a bunch of those in your company. And long term, it's going to do more damage than good. How do I increase my leasing? No, flip it. How do I make sure my leasing staff leases nothing? Well, number one, don't answer the telephone. Number two, don't call anybody back. You can just go down the list because it's so much easier for us to find negatives than it is positives. And once you create the list, flip it, invert it, and make sure you're not doing that stuff. Learn what actual delegation is. A lot of people think delegation is, I told you to do it. Well, there's parts of this. When you tell someone what to do it, you have to make sure they know how to do it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Multifamily Chronicles. I'm your host, Adrian Danila. Our special guest today is Ken Doble. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ken is a partner at QR Capital. Please walk us through your journey in real estate and how did you end up in property management?
Absolutely. When I was young, I read a book called Nothing Down by Robert Allen, which is a very popular book. And I thought I can get into real estate and I can become rich. And I grew up in Section 8 housing, so I knew what it was like to be poor. And I said, I'm going to become a millionaire. That was my goal. I was going to become a millionaire. I went into the military, and I actually served in Desert Storm and Operation Just Cause. So I was a two-time combat vet, paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne. When I got out, I started a company called All American Realty. I got my real estate license. And I realized very quickly that I didn't like selling houses to homeowners. They couldn't decide. I'd much rather deal with investors. So that didn't work. I actually failed at that business. So I went into looking for a job. And the only thing I knew was, of course, real estate. So there was an ad in the paper for a property manager. I needed a place to live at that point. So I went and interviewed for it, and I got the job. It was a little small apartment complex, 24 units in Conyers, Georgia. When I got in there, they had a problem with leasing, and this was a Class C apartment. So one of the things I did, which I didn't realize it was different or unique, I just simply would show apartments at any time. I would show an apartment at 11 o'clock at night. I would show it on Sunday. I would show it on anytime in Saturday. Anytime someone wanted to show up, I would say, I'll show you the apartment. Sure, why not? In addition to that, we had a problem with people hanging out. There were vagrants hanging out and people sitting out. There were chairs and they were doing things like that. So I simply went out and started throwing all the stuff in the dumpster, and I was very aggressive with them. And I evicted multiple people and cleaned the property up. And of course, the property was very successful. At that point, the company that I was with only had 3 apartment complexes, and they were actually doing everything by hand. So all their payroll, all their accounting, they were manually writing checks. Everything was manual. And I've always been a big lover of technology. And I had a Mac computer way before everybody else did. So I told them that I could actually do their accounting. Now, I'm a high school dropout, but I went and got a couple of books on accounting. It didn't seem that hard to me. I figured it out, and I put the entire company onto an accounting system called DAC Easy. Wasn't anything easy about DAC Easy accounting, but that's what we did. And then from there, my roles just expanded. Whatever problems came up within the company, I would try to figure out how to fix it and solve the problems. And I can give you multiple examples of that. And the more you learn, the better you can get at solving problems. I remember an example. We had an apartment complex where they came back and told us the entire subfloor had been rotted out and it needed to replace. It was like $200,000. And it was a tremendous amount of money on that deal. And we didn't want to do a capital call. So I put overalls on, climbed underneath the building, and took a camera with me and a flashlight. And I discovered that there was one section of the beam that was actually rotten. The rest of it was fine. And I confronted the contractor and the engineer about it, and they admitted, yeah, you could just replace the one. So from $200,000 down to $10,000. So I've noticed that contractors and engineers have a tendency to overscope. And if you're not willing to get dirty and go look at it and see it for yourself and ask questions, that's just one example. I can go on and on about examples where I've seen this in action, overscoping things. So anyway, if you can become very good at solving problems in your organization and keep learning and building your skill sets, you can advance. And that's what happened with me. I eventually was in charge of the entire company. I had 700 odd employees reporting to me. We were in 11 states. We had $350 million worth of development. And of course, it all went boom in 2008, but that's a whole nother story.
Ken, I need to pick up on a couple of things. I don't want to go past this. First of all, you grew up in Section 8 housing, and then you were a high school dropout.
That's correct.
You became so successful running a company, operation level, being the top person in a company, over 700 employees. What are some things that actually help you through your journey, and what gave you the drive to become this successful at this level of success?
I felt to myself that I did not go to college, so I didn't feel like I could, I had to work harder. I had to learn more. I had to study harder. And whatever the problem was, the first thing I would do is go to the bookstore, try to find a book on the subject, whatever it might be. So there was definitely, I think there was fear. Like I definitely felt like I wasn't good enough. And that was a drive. And I think the other thing, of course, being from a poor family, I knew what it was like not to have any money. Now, I was a millionaire by the time I was 30, but at the time, I mean, it was definitely some painful situations. And I remember, going and having to pull $5 out of my bank account to pay for gas and not having any money for food. So I know what it's like to be poor. So I was more driven by not wanting to be poor than anything else, but I actually enjoyed it. That's another thing. I mean, you have to really enjoy what you're doing. And I loved learning new things, whatever it might be, whatever job you're in, you can always learn more and challenge yourself to say, hey, well, how does the maintenance guy work? I didn't like it when I found the property managers didn't know anything about what the maintenance guys were doing, or how can they manage something if they don't understand it? So I would always challenge them and say, okay, well, how do you know that's right? Can't they do it faster? How can we do it easier? So it was more things like that. So there's lots of rules and lessons that I've learned doing this, and I've screwed a lot of things up. And I'll tell you get really good by making lots of mistakes. And trust me, I've made a lot of them.
What advice would you have for someone that's looking up to someone like you in an executive position, top person in an organization? They want to become Ken one day. What are some pieces of advice, practical pieces of advice? What type of a recipe they should follow, if we might say so? It's not a recipe, but some top pieces of advice that come into mind.
The biggest thing I would say is be incredibly curious. Always ask questions and think about what it is you're doing. Why are you doing it? How can you make it better? I think too often, I use this example a lot when I'm interviewing people. I call it the dead tree principle. And you'll hear someone say, I've got 10 years experience as a regional manager or a maintenance supervisor, whatever it might be. Well, really, that's not accurate. What you really have is someone who has 1 year or 2 years of experience, and then they stop growing. They stop developing their skill sets. And they don't know, like they haven't read any books on the industry. They don't read any of the articles or magazines. They don't go to any of the trade shows. They don't do anything at all to improve their skill sets or get better. And when you see that and you're interviewing them and you can ask them simple questions, they're not really expanding or getting better. And, I love Jim Rome. He's one of my favorite authors. And Jim Rome says, don't wish it were easier, wish you were better. And often in life, it's your skills that are lacking. And that's what we see again and again. So if someone really wants to develop and advance through the ranks, I would say several things. Number one, work at a smaller company. The faster growing companies are going to offer more opportunities. These giant companies that have 250,000 units, they're siloed. There's all these structures and procedures. There's so much politics going on. But if you get with a company that was incredibly, and I was lucky because I got with a company that was growing very fast. Daniel, was a great CEO in terms of growing the company, and he grew it very fast. And of course, that offered me lots of opportunities as the company, grew. In addition, you have to be willing to outwork. At the beginning, you don't have a lot of skills. And that you have to trade time for skills. And a lot of times people are always looking at, I want to get a big raise. I want to do this and that. Instead of saying, well, if I make myself more valuable to the company, they'll want to pay me more. And I think that people miss that.
I want to move forward now and talk about QR Capital. Tell us about the inception. How did this, started, and a little bit take us through the journey of QR Capital, where you are today.
Yeah. QR Capital started in my basement. My partner, Christian Shields, and I were actually, we're doing martial arts together, and he was the chief investment officer for the company. And this is during, basically the destruction of Miles Properties when it was going through bankruptcy, and it was a really difficult time. And we decided, you know what, we can do this. Let's start a business. So we did start the business, and I will tell you that tremendous change happened. In 2008, the wheels came off the financial markets. And normally Atlanta had like 450 to 500 sales transactions a year prior to 2008, 2009. In 2009, there were 4 transactions, and we were one of them. And our first deal didn't close till the end of in December. And it was a small little apartment complex. We, had to go hat in hand and try to raise money from investors and talk to people. And definitely it wasn't easy. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, starting your own business is easy. It's actually terrifying. And there's lots of periods where I was really stressed. So was my partner, and we couldn't pay ourselves salaries. I mean, there was definitely some periods where we didn't have a lot. But eventually, we kept kept at it, and we were able to succeed. I think we ended up buying around almost 10,000 apartments. We bought and sold them. We only have one left now at this point. We're selling off most of our assets and waiting for the next cycle so we can start buying apartments again.
Let's talk about the next cycle. But before we go to the next cycle, Ken, I want to ask you about what are you seeing in the current market? And I want to get really specific because, when you say market, like US, it's a continent. Like if we're talking about like in generic terms, we're never going to get, to the bottom of it. So I want to ask you markets that you're familiar with. What are some trends that you see in those particular markets? Is it a good time to buy? Is it like, what do you see? Everything, like business is picking up. What is it that you see in those particular markets that you're looking at?
Well, let's be clear. We primarily buy Class B apartments, B plus apartments, maybe A minus. Initially, when we started, we bought Class C because that's all we could afford. I think there's different activities happening in different markets, and different levels of apartments. But I would say this, right now, a lot of the sellers are still expecting 5 caps. And that's good, rightly so. But the all-in debt cost is over 6.4. So you have something called negative leverage. And that means for every dollar you're borrowing, you're actually losing money from your leverage. So I think that a lot of people, when they say, oh, it's now a good time or not, maybe there's deals out there, I'm sure there are, that actually do make good financial sense. It's just hard for us to make the numbers work with a margin of safety where we feel comfortable taking these types of buying opportunities right now. So we've seen probably about a 20% reduction in apartment values from the peak of where they were to where they are now. We're seeing transaction volume dry up. There's just not a lot of deals that are actually going. We actually are starting to see more foreclosures. Now, the lenders, rightly so, they extend and pretend, because if the lenders can extend the period, they're hoping the Fed drops the rates. If the Fed drops the rates, that will save a lot of these owners, and they can then refinance the deals. They can make their numbers work. I mean, we had one deal where our debt service went up, it was floating rate, went up $1.5 million in the space of 18 months. It was a 756 bed student housing deal. So, we definitely know that that's across the board. And the other thing that was interesting is your caps. So these floating rate mortgages, they have these interest rate caps. When we first got our interest rate caps, they were like $75,000 for an interest rate cap. And that just simply tops the interest rate that you would have to pay. So it's kind of like insurance. So in case interest rates really go up. Well, those same caps were like almost $500,000. So tremendous difference in the capital markets. And so now you have a ton of loans maturing. And there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines, billions of dollars of funds waiting to pounce on these distressed deals. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I think that sets a floor at how low these numbers will go. But right now, we can't make the numbers work, based on the current interest rates. We need the interest rates to come down, and we need the prices to come down, or maybe a combination thereof.
From an investment perspective now, Ken, the current administration has been targeting multifamily 2 ways. The first way was the software that does, that controls pricing, like that does automatic pricing, just like the airlines have, and just like many other industries do have, right? And there was never an issue up until recent, and it became very political. That's the first one.
Yeah.
Second one is the current administration also, one of the candidates is advocating rent control at a national level. I just wanted to say, not as an expert, because, by no means I'm an expert in economy, but by common sense, person, when we look at the pockets, like, look at San Francisco and New York, and look at the devastation that rent control did, do we really want to expand that to the entire country? And how those 2 components, like those 2 points on a political agenda, are affecting the investors and, people that actually want to develop, wanted to do something in real estate and provide housing, because, housing, it's a pretty dire need for, like, you can't live without a housing.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. I understand the motivation behind these things. Unfortunately, economics doesn't prove that actually works. I don't think there's a successful example where rent control has worked in any market. So that's definitely a problem that I think they're going to have to deal with. But look, they'll probably, if they win, they'll probably try to pass that. You're seeing more and more pushing. The whole pricing model situation is, we had a pricing model. We actually built it, and it was based on, your rental comps, which of course you're constantly looking at what your comps are doing. Your comps bracket where your prices are. So if you're thinking you can charge, $850 and they're charging $750, well, you can't charge $850. So there's a bracketing going on, and you're always looking at those prices. I think what the government is saying is that the fact that all these companies report into one software, the software is taking all that information and it can adjust it much faster, which is true. So I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert on that, so I won't, give my opinion on that. I do know that pricing models, obviously, they work. Look at the airlines, you look at the hotels, they work. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more companies trying to do it. Now, maybe they'll change the rules of how they do it to get around potentially things that the government comes up with. So that's what I would say about that. I do think that pricing systems are great. I think they can definitely leverage your return. My one critique of them is it's almost impossible to really test to know how much of it was the general market and how much of it was the actual pricing software that drove that top line revenue growth that you're looking at.
Ken, I want to talk real estate investments. It's a very appealing thing for most people to build wealth. And then if I'm just looking on LinkedIn alone, every third post or fourth post is, people talking about how great it is to invest in real estate and why they should, be investing with this individual particular company. So for someone that wants to start, they don't know where to, really start, and they don't have the education, the acumen of like understanding, selecting like the good investment deals from the bad investment deals. What are some pieces of advice? What should like a first time investor look for when they're picking a company to invest in when it comes to real estate and especially multifamily?
Whenever I see pictures of Bentleys and people on their jet and all this cash, I'd be a little skeptical of those individuals. I know it appeals the lifestyle and they show you the glamour of real estate investing, but I can tell you that there's a lot of headaches and pitfalls of real estate investing, and it's not easy. If it were easy, everybody would be rich, and it's just not. There's a lot of issues with it. In terms of which things a young person should do or someone who wants to get into it, well, I think there's state and there's national investors associations. I think getting around other investors and learning, a lot of them have programs that they can actually get you in. They have meetups where they talk. And I think don't pay the stupid tax. And I always say this to folks, when you start a new thing, whatever it is, a new business, whatever it might be, or a new venture, you're dumb. You don't know what you don't know. And if it makes sense for you to pay someone for the expertise or to partner with them, which is even better. And they can walk you through, here's how we're doing it, and here's why we're doing it. And then you learn, you get the education. You may not knock it out of the park the first one you do, but at least you get the education from it. I think a lot of people are looking for shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. Real estate's hard work. And I think that's definitely been, glamorized, like, oh, I have this and I have that, and look at my Maybach or whatever. I think it's much more important to focus on the basics. I think reading books can help you, but what I tell people a lot of times is you can read all the books about swimming you want, but until you jump in the pool, you don't know how to swim. And it would be much better for you to be a small partner in a small duplex or something like that than it would be for you to jump into, some massive real estate investment that you know nothing of, and more than likely going to be taken advantage of.
Ken, you've been part of scaling organizations. First as a chief operating officer, you started at very ground as a property manager, worked your way up, oversaw operations for such a large organization, and then you went on an ownership side, and you build a company that actually own throughout time 10,000 apartment homes. What are some lessons that you've learned from scaling businesses, both from an employee executive side and then from owner side?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I actually had a list of these, and some of the former employees will probably tell you about me making them do book reports and things of that nature. But one of the things I always used to say is over communicate. The only thing certain about communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And again, we see companies, they'll tell, I told them to do it, but that's not the same thing as getting them to really understand it. Often we don't need to be taught, we need to be reminded. I think that was Winston Churchill that said that. Inspect what you expect. I got that from the military. A lot of times you'll tell somebody, hey, I'm coming to look at your property. And if you never show up, then you don't think you care. So you have to show up and you have to inspect. You don't have to do it every time. It can be random. And that creates the okay, he might be coming. And it definitely does that. Curiosity. I constantly say this, you got to keep asking questions. Why do we do this? I was at a property once and I was talking to one of the property managers and I said, what's the dumbest thing we make you do? And she goes, really? No. I said, what drives you nuts? She goes, oh, this month-end closeout process. It takes forever to do this at the end of each month. I said, give me that report. She gave me this long checklist. I went back to the corporate office. I walked over to the training department and I said, hey, why don't we make them do this? And she looked at it and said, we don't need that. Accounting makes them do it. So I took the list, walked over to accounting, and I said, hey, why do you make them do it? And they said, we don't need that. Training does. So it's just example after example. There was a point where they did need it when we were transitioning from a new software. But again and again, we see this where people don't, you don't think about stuff. Like ask the questions. And you'd be surprised some of the great ideas that are inside the organizations because you don't ask. So I think that's important. Incentives. Charlie Munger says this: show me your incentives and I'll tell you what your outcome is going to be. And I think a lot of companies pay lip service to incentives, but they don't have good incentive policies. I'll give you an example. We had a 562 unit apartment complex called Regal Park in Texas. And it had a walk-up, a 3-story walk-up. And it was very hot. And I was out there talking to the staff. And I noticed when I was looking at the status report that we had a lot of vacancies in the upstairs units. And I said, why is that? And they said, no one wants those units. They're terrible. Everybody hates walking up those stairs. So I looked at the manager. I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to offer triple leasing bonuses while I'm at lunch on any unit that's leased upstairs. Okay, so we went to lunch. Of course, we were going over all our numbers. Probably took us 2 hours. When I came back, they had at least 4 apartments upstairs. So incentives matter. And I think that's really an important thing that I learned. Close the gap. Now, this is an important thing. A lot of times, these large corporations, they have these hundreds of SOPs. This is your procedure. This is your standard. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And it's great to sit in the corporate tower. I always used to say it when whiteout was around. I used to say, we're up there sniffing whiteout. Because when we go to the site and we actually see what happens, we discovered that there's a big gap between what they're actually doing at the site level and what we think they're doing at the site level. And as an executive, or as a property manager, you need to understand those differences and point them out to your boss. So, hey, do we really need to do this? Look at this. This is not what's happening. And I think you might find that there's better ways to do it. One of the first things I did when I took over the property operations, we had this huge binders of all these SOPs. I threw them in the trash. So we're going to start over. And we're going to start using common sense. And we went from 500-600 pages down to like less than 50-60 pages of just common sense stuff. Let's see here. Okay, I see this again and again. Do you run the community or the company, it could be, or does it run you? And you can tell when you come to a property and the manager looks at a 1,000-yard stare where they're just overwhelmed. There's constant problems. There's constant issues. They're not running the property's running them. And they haven't mastered the use of their telephone. They haven't mastered the use of their calendar. They don't know how to properly delegate. These things are skills that you can learn to be better. And a lot of times it requires coaching. And that's okay. But that's on the regional to teach them and to show them how to get there. And that's a whole nother process. We'll get into training here as we go. All right, let's see here. Invert, turn your problems upside down. This is another Charlie Munger. I'm a big fan of Charlie Munger if that hasn't come through. Munger says this: we're hardwired to find negative stuff. So when you say, hey, how do I increase my leasing? No, flip it. How do I make sure my leasing staff leases nothing? Well, number one, don't answer the telephone. Number two, don't call anybody back. You can just go down the list because it's so much easier for us to find negatives than it is positives. So now once you create the list, flip it, invert it, and make sure you're not doing that stuff. Pretty basic. Let's see here. I have never found a situation where anger makes it better. I see this a lot where people are upset, they're angry, and they lash out, and it usually only makes things worse. All right. Don't focus on blame, focus on fixing the problem. And I think far too often people are so hung up, and a lot of that's political games. The bigger the organization, the more bureaucracy there exists, and the more the political games happen. And sometimes the people that are promoted are the people that are best at playing the political game than the people who are the most competent and the most effective. And we see this a lot in all sorts of organizations. There's a lot of different brown nosers, as the people call them, right? Let's see here. I've already said don't pay more stupid tax than you have to. I think that's a critical thing. Learn what actual delegation is. A lot of people think delegation is, I told you to do it. Well, there's parts of this. When you tell someone what to do it, you have to make sure they know how to do it. You have to understand what your standards are. And then you have to follow up with them. And don't just make sure that delegation is such a critical part of this whole learning thing. Develop and promote people from within. Nothing fires people up more than knowing they have a shot to advance. You want to piss people off? Go outside and hire all your outside for your promotions. And I'll tell you, my best hires have always been people I've promoted. They always surprised me. They did better because they wanted it more. They were hungrier and they really loved it. And I think that's a really important thing. Always hire from within when you can. You should be developing them. Cross-training. Training is another big thing. A lot of times you'll have assistant managers and property managers. I always told my assistant managers, hey, we need to make sure they're cross-trained in all the things the managers are doing. The maintenance supervisor, hey, whatever you're doing, we need to make sure your tech, he one day may take your role. You need to be training him, cross-training him on these things. The other thing is training without testing is worthless. I cannot tell you how many times I've sent people to these classes and paid all this money and they come back and they're fired up for a couple of days, but they didn't learn anything. And if you're not testing it, if you know there's a test afterwards, you might take notes. You might actually learn something. and actually apply it. So a lot of times I see all these great training programs, but there's no testing. So what good is it? So I think, by the way, different training for different things. I think maintenance guys, they need to actually get the physical test. Like we would go into a unit and, break things and then time them and say, okay, what are you doing? We'd have our supervisor walk around and watch them fix stuff. And they would learn more from that interaction because, oh, this is what's wrong with it. Yeah, I need to do this, this, and that. And then they would learn if they screwed it up, they'd say, well, this is how you fix it. So that was, kind of fun. Definitely something you want to do. The no asshole rule. I can't say this enough. In organizations, you're going to have some people who are very effective, but they're assholes. They're terrible. And you know what? It's very hard sometimes to fire those people because they're getting the results. But if you want to hurt a company, have a bunch of those in your company. And long term, it's going to do more damage than good. You're better off just not having them. Part of being a leader is knowing about people and understanding and realizing that, hey, that's not the way you treat people. You're not any better than they are. So I think a lot of people get ego. Ego gets in the way. Constantly ask for feedback. I see this a lot where people think they know everything. I've learned a lot from the maintenance guys, from the leasing agent. They'll teach me like, hey, you screwed this up. You could change this. But if you're not asking for it and they don't feel comfortable, like a lot of people are terrified. They don't want to talk to the boss. They're afraid. Onboarding. This is a huge issue for companies. You hire someone new, you put them into a new role. Who do they call? Well, they don't want to call their boss. If they call their boss because they don't know something, they look like they're an idiot. They should have a mentor. They should have somebody who's in a similar role. Hey, yeah, this is how you handle that. This is what you need to do. They're going to feel way more comfortable calling that person than they are calling you. What gets measured gets done. And this is just basic 101 management. And I think what you're going to find, and I'll summarize it at this point, the basics are the most important overlooked thing that I see in property management. You can drop me in any property in the world and I can go to it and I can look at it through a lens and say, more than likely the basics are not being done. And that's why they're not performing well.
Ken, you're also an author. You wrote a book, The 5 Ps of Property Management.
Mm-hmm.
What key message do you hope that readers takes away from reading it?
Well, the 5 Ps was just simply a framework. So we know about, marketing. We talked about, the marketing 4 Ps. I just simply added the process. So we talk about people being the most important. The 5 Ps is a framework for a property management company or any, real estate company to go in and evaluate, create a checklist, a comprehensive checklist to audit their sites to make sure they're actually doing the right things. And we see that again and again. So what I'm trying to do with the book is just simply, hey, here's a framework. And by the way, your company may be different than my company. You may have different problems, different class of properties in a different city. Like someone in New York City is going to be totally different than someone in Texas or Atlanta. So it's important to know that it's a living, breathing thing that the company has to take and run with. And I think there's a big missing piece in a lot of these companies out there. They don't have auditors, and the auditors are not, I got you. The auditors are trainers. I always said my auditors were / trainers. So they would go out, they would have a comprehensive checklist, and they would check and train. And that's an important thing. So the audit, of course, makes sure, and by the way, you have to put incentives to the audit, because if you don't put incentives, then they really don't care about the audit. And my audits were always designed, were they properly trained? Did they actually know what they were supposed to be doing? And by the way, it was every role. It was the leasing agent, the property manager, the maintenance supervisor, the techs, everybody on the site had some component being checked. And it created a lot more accountability at the site level.
You mentioned people, Ken. And I think, this is a matter of personal opinion. I don't base it on any type of research, but I believe that within our lifetimes, businesses at a worldwide level will grow at a pace that outpaces the population growth. Therefore, we're always going to be short of people within our lifetime. You could agree or disagree with this, but I think this would be an issue to deal with for the remainder of our lives. Saying that, what are some ways in which companies could do better at hiring people, and not just hiring people because we don't want just some bodies to fill positions with, but hiring the best people? What are some things that some companies should be looking for and should embrace this philosophy when it comes to recruiting the best of the best?
Well, hiring's difficult. It's really hard to evaluate during an interviewing process. And people say they're really good at it, but I think most people's hiring hit rate is probably 50-50 if you look back over a long enough period of time. I would say this: first, promote from within. Have a bench strength where you're basically training and developing the current staff. So it fires people up. It's much easier to hire at the lower levels than it is at the higher levels. So building that framework out and having a pipeline, we used to call it our pipeline strength. We knew these 4 assistant managers were already trained. They were ready to actually be promoted. So we could then go to them and offer them the job, as opposed to hiring and just bringing in some outsider to the organization. They already have our culture. It's much easier to build culture in people who've already grown up through the company than it is to bring a bunch of outsiders into the company, especially if you're rapidly growing. So I think that's an important component. I keep coming back to that. In terms of getting the best, lots and lots of interviews. And sometimes it's very frustrating. I can recall a situation where we were interviewing multiple property managers for one of our properties. And the lady came in and she was professionally dressed. She had a business plan. She was very impressive. We hired her. She was an absolute disaster. And, terrible. She was not delegating everything to the assistant manager, wasn't opening her door, wasn't talking to residents. She did everything opposite of what she said. So you can be really good at interviewing and be terrible at your job. And I think a lot of companies are trying to show that, hey, can you do work? Can you actually, I remember once interview, I was talking to this gentleman and he was interviewing for a financial analyst position with the acquisition team. And he was saying that he had all this experience and this and that. And I said, well, great. Here's an actual deal we're underwriting right now. Here's the numbers. Here's a calculator. Run the numbers and tell me what the IRR is. Tell me what the net present value is. Going back and forth with him, and he couldn't do it. And he was from a grad school, and I was like, wow. What happens? I've seen this a lot. I had another situation where I had a CFO candidate. This is when we were fairly large, and he had a CPA. He had a big university he came in from, and I was like, wow, this guy's impressive. He worked at a REIT. I was like, oh, I don't need to interview this guy. I mean, he's the man. So I talked to him. We hired him. I paid him a big money, big bonus and all this stuff. And he was absolutely terrible. And I know what happens. I call it silo rot. In these large organizations, basically these individuals get in and they do the same thing over and over again. And they never, ever get challenged or pushed in other directions. When you're a small business and you're growing, those people are pushed in every single direction. Oh, I got an accounting problem. I got an HR problem. I've got a maintenance problem, whatever it might be. And they're having to deal with it. So they're much more well-rounded. Whereas these companies where they have, 200,000 employees, it's so hard. They're in that silo. They're one little, unless they have a train. That's why a lot of companies, they'll actually have their executives work at different branches, different groups. They'll work in the bottling distribution. They'll work in the accounting. They'll work in, the formulas or whatever it might be. So they get more broad experience. And we see a lot of that missing in these large corporations when you're doing that. So I think that's an important thing. Onboarding and training, I think, is another huge thing. I keep coming back to this again and again. Onboarding, when someone comes in the door, you want to make sure they know what's expected of them, how to do it. They have a mentor, and because a lot of your people that leave, a lot of times don't feel properly supported. And you see that a lot of times as well. But hiring is a very difficult thing. And, in terms of whether or not we're going to need it, I think the AI is going to have a tremendous impact on our profession, and how big, we just don't know yet. But I do think that there will be, basically you're going to get more productivity out of the current employees, and you'll probably have them managing more properties. So whether or not there's less, that'll be a whole nother question. But yeah, I understand your logic of, as population growth, they need more homes, more apartments. So logically there would be more jobs. Absolutely. So I could see that rationale as well.
How about technology in general, and technology that's being built and developed for real estate, for multifamily? What's your take on technology? I mean, technology, it's an amazing tool for us when it works, when it serves us. But there's a flood. We're flooded with technology every day. Every day there's like new technology that's coming on the market. So how do you look at technology? How do you vet technology? How do you pick the technology that's the best for your group and for your business?
Yeah, I think that the property management in particular has always been behind. I mean, I can remember when we had apartment guides and we had paper and we had the internet explosion. Eventually it was Craigslist, and now it's just evolved. Now it's, apartments, Google AdWords. So we definitely have seen these changes in our industry. The centralized technology we have now will make the process much faster. I think that you're going to see a lot more automation of certain jobs. For example, the assistant manager role, even parts of the leasing person's role are going to be more automated by the AI and the technology. There are already a lot of companies that are offering, AI leasing. Now, whether or not the customers are going to love that, we just don't know yet. It's still very new in terms of how that'll roll out, but eventually it'll get there and you will see that. And what you're going to have is, property manager might be over 2 or 3 properties instead of just one, because a lot of the grunt work that they're having to deal with is going to be automated away. But the problem is knowing where that cost benefit ratio is. And I will tell you, I'd rather err on the side of caution and be slower to adapt than be on the bleeding edge of technology. I'll give you a funny story. So Daniel was the CEO of the company, and we had all these properties, and he went out to tour a property, and they had motion sensor light fixtures in the clubhouse, and of course it was energy savings. And we calculated that we could save some big dollar amount if we put these in all our units, and there'd be a quick payback time. So I remember sitting at the meeting, telling everybody, I want this installed. I don't want any excuses. You guys need to do it. And this is when I was, relatively new into this, and I had not been humbled. And I said, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. And they did it. And okay, we had these things installed in everything. And then I went out to one of the properties, and I was sitting there, and I saw the assistant manager kept doing this. I said, what are you doing? She goes, oh, the light, it just keeps coming on. I don't shake my hand, it will automatically go out. We had bought the wrong ones in 76 properties. So I actually took one of them out, and I put it in a piece of plastic, and I set it right there. So whenever I thought about some decision, I would pause and reflect and say, you know what, I need to slow down and really make sure that this is the right fit. And then this is not a stupid mistake, because it cost us money to do that. And I just thought, I looked at myself, I had to laugh at myself because it was me. I was the one that did it. I was told to do it, but I should have done more research, and that's what happened. So anyway, yeah, technology is cool. I think it really is going to transform society as we know. And I don't think we're ready for it yet. I think what's coming is going to blow people away when we get ChatGPT 5.
As far as management strategies, Ken, as a multifamily investor, do you prefer to self-manage, or do you prefer to third-party manage, and why?
Wow. I think that most ownership groups go through this process. They feel that the majority of third-party managers are terrible. They feel like as they get bigger, they can do it better. And they eventually hire people, and then they eventually fire people, and then they eventually get frustrated. But eventually they're so large that they just keep it going on. It's a thankless task. Property management is. People, if you're doing well, that's because the market's good. It's not because of you guys. If you're doing bad, well, that's because you guys suck and you're not doing things right. And that's, you guys don't know how to do the basics or something of that nature. So I've seen this again and again.
Are you currently self-managing or third party? I know that you only have one deal, but
yeah. Well, you have to, in order to get economies of scales to make the numbers work, you need, probably 2,000 units to make it worth your time. We only have one property now, 750 something beds. So no, we're definitely not self-managing at this point.
Totally makes sense. Tell us about what you envision for the future for QR Capital. What's your vision about the future for your company?
Well, we definitely continue to look at deals. We know that the market's moving excess, so we definitely feel like there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and we'll be looking to buy deals in the future again at some point.
If someone wants to get in touch with you to discuss, investment opportunities or just about anything, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Just get on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. Let's
talk about the future and your vision for the future. How do you see multifamily in 2025 and beyond? Like, what are some things that you see happening, or like you think that they're going to happen within the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think that AI will destroy many of the jobs that we have. I think, like I said earlier, the assistant manager role will be totally automated away. A lot of the leasing agent role will be automated away, especially the initial calls and the follow-up and of that. It's not going to be totally gone, obviously. You'll still have leasing agents at the site, and you'll still have a property manager because people want to deal with humans. I think that's definitely coming. In the future, if Elon has his way, I'm sure we'll have these androids that potentially could do maintenance work orders, but I think that's far off. But who knows? Maybe it comes out next year. I'm doubtful. I think that you're going to see other things. Drones. The technology of drones could really make things easy for exterior inspections, for punch list maintenance work. You could send the drone into the unit and it would go around and come back with a detailed list of what needs to be done. So I could see a lot of drone. I think 3D printing. There's a lot of specialized parts that you might need, especially for older HVAC or older equipment that you're trying to fix. They could actually download those designs and then just print the parts that you need. So I think that stuff's coming, and we'll see more and more companies try to adapt to that, and that'll change how we do things. Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. I really do. I'm excited about the future, and I love AI. I'm a big into ChatGPT. I took several courses on it, trying to figure out how to use it in my business. I think the automation part of it is going to be huge. There's a lot of people that are going to be very terrified of it, no doubt. But I think we're going to have companies that use it, and then people that are bankrupt. That's how it's going to happen.
Company culture, Ken. How do you build solid company culture? When you look at job advertisements or company websites, the most common thing that you'll find is that we're all about people. When you're looking at the turnover numbers in an industry for employees, ours, it's sitting right there really close to hospitality. I think, the real rates, if they were to be reported in a real way, there will be like between 60 and 80% at the site level. And, most companies have, high turnover rate at a corporate level too. So, that tells like an opposite story. How do we build a solid culture in a company?
It starts at the top. If the top leadership group is not, I remember it's a cultural thing. I remember I would find an accounting person talking down to a manager, and I would stop them immediately and say, no, you only exist to support them. They're the ones that are actually bringing in the money. So I never want to hear you speak to them like that again. They're not your servants. It's the other way around. And I think a lot of corporate offices, they become like that, where they're, wholly on to us. We're the best, and the rest of you are peons. And you'll answer, oh, corporate called. It shouldn't be that way. But it starts at the top. So the first thing is that the leadership group has to really care about the people, has to ask questions, has to try to make things better for them. I always told all the maintenance supervisors, I'm your best friend. I want to try to make things easier for you. When I showed up to the property, I kept seeing the pools full of all these leaves and stuff. And I asked the supervisor, man, this is a lot of work, because you wouldn't believe it. And I said, well, how do we fix it? And we looked around and I said, why don't we cut all these trees back from the thing? Yeah, what a common sense idea. Saved him hours of work. So it was a capital cost up front, of course, but these common sense things, and by the way, word gets out that you actually care about the people. It has an impact. The other thing that happens is, the no asshole rule. A lot of people don't leave their jobs because of the culture. They leave their jobs because they hate their boss. And by the way, it's funny, when you promote from within at the same staff, sometimes they try to become their friends. That's one extreme. And sometimes they're tyrants. That's the other extreme. And then sometimes it's just in the middle. You have to make sure that you stop that from happening. And that's part of your values. What your say is important, but it's more important than having a plaque on the wall. It's, do you actually lead by example? Do you actually do it? When you're at the site, do you pick up and get the trash? Do you actually help? And I think that's something that's important. We definitely have high turnover. There's no doubt about it. And I think that it's, unfortunately, I don't see it changing a lot. There are some companies that probably have lower because they have good teams and something like that. But it's definitely a tough thing. I'll tell you that. It's definitely tough, because think about it this way. It's not like every month the cycle starts over again. We're moving in people, we're collecting the rents. It's never ending. It's just constant, never ending. And if the leadership at the top doesn't really embrace the people in the field and really value them and ask their questions, get feedback, then they're not going to want to work super hard. Why? Just do the minimum. Just do the basics.
Ken, inspiration. Who are the people that inspired you the most, made the most positive impact in your career and in your life? And it could be the same person that did both, if it's just one person.
I think more books were my biggest inspiration. I remember in 8th grade when I read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I really thought that was a powerful book. All through my life, I've loved to read. And reading was always a way for me to learn through other people's mistakes and experiences. I would say Charlie Munger. He's probably the wisest man around. I think Alex Ramosi is the new, this generation's Charlie Munger. I really enjoy his stuff. I actually watch all his videos and actually do printouts and make notes on everything he's saying, and then say, how can I relate that back to my business? How can I improve my business based on what he said? So I think that Jim Rome was another one. That was he's a motivational speaker. So I've always been fascinated by that. And it always, fired me up to think that there was possibilities. Brian Tracy is another one. So it was more based on that. And I saw lots of examples when I was younger of how not to be a boss, more anti-role models. Like I would not want to be led that way. So I definitely would not want to, I just didn't want to be that way. Look, there's a big balance between being hard and being ridiculous. And I think sometimes it gets blended. And I can give it horror stories of, people being really bad bosses. And I think that's the number one reason people leave, is because they have a terrible boss.
One of the questions that I want to ask most of, if not all of my guests, is legacy. When it's all said and done, how would you like to be remembered?
For me, when I look back at it, I just want to be very curious, and I want to keep asking questions. And if I can get one person to ask more questions or think differently, I think that would be a success. I'm not looking to leave some large imprint on the world. I like to learn. That's one of my passions, is learning. I really enjoy learning. And I like seeing people grow. I tell you, some of the best stories I have are when I get people that were leasing agents that got promoted to regional managers all the way through to, it ran the whole, I love that, because I want to see their success. And I think that's a great example of what you can do if you apply yourself. And by the way, I think our industry is a better position than a lot of other industries in terms of AI. because we're going to be with some of the people always need homes. We always need a place to stay. I don't think that's going away.
Ken, thank you so much for taking the time being with me and with the audience today. Amazing conversation. What are some final thoughts, some things that you wish you had opportunity to say during the conversation and you didn't?
Well, I'll say this. Several years ago, I actually was introduced to Stoicism and the concept of minimalism. And those two have made a biggest impact on my life, because Stoicism made me realize I can't control things outside myself. I have to focus on what I can control. Minimalism made me realize, hey, you know what? I don't need all this extra stuff. And we all go through this thing where I had the huge house, I had the nice Mercedes, I had all the things that, hey, this guy's successful. But I realized that's not what makes you happy. And I think this consumerism is wired into our mind. So if I could go back and tell myself hey, get into Stoicism, learn about minimalism, and you'll be happier. And by the way, invest in your S500, SP500, and just let the money grow and compound, because the power of compound, I knew the rules, but I didn't follow it. And how often do we know what we should be doing, but we don't do it? And you see that over and over again in life, where we know what we should be doing, but we just don't do it. And the power of compounding is not just in money, but it's in life. If you don't eat right, if you don't exercise, if you don't pay attention to your significant other, on a daily basis, you have to build. It's like putting deposits in the bank. And people don't do this, and then they take it for granted. They wake up and their loved one doesn't love them anymore because they're not paying attention to them. That compounding really builds. And anyway, that's definitely something that I would, if I went back in time, I would say, hey, get into Stoicism, get into minimalism, and really understand the power of compounding. And that would really have helped me as a younger man if I had learned those things.
Ken, thanks again for being with us today. Amazing conversation. I hope that we continue this down the road. There were so many other questions that I wanted to ask you, but obviously we had to be mindful of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for watching another episode of Multifamily Chronicles. I'm Adrian Danila, your host, and I hope to see you back on the next episode. Take care. Have an amazing afternoon.